Hi, this is DoNotCiv. This video is going to be about consequentialism. First, a few words on my previous video, Hard Times Call for Hard Ways, which I've deleted because I wasn't happy with it, and I went a little bit overboard on the politics. Against my better judgment, I dipped my toe into the political waters and started talking about various GOP political candidates in harsh terms, as well as the people who would vote for them in harsh terms. And but as Wild Bill Hickok said, I never apologize to nobody for anything. Yeah, and I'm not going to, because I mean, you guys, you've got Ron Paul, who's one of the best candidates to come down the pike in the last 30 years, but you reject him, reject somebody who would be an excellent president, and you go for, well, anyway, I said I wasn't going to get into it, and you go for Gingrich and Romney. And okay, fine, vote for who you want. I'm gonna, you know, like I said, against my better judgment, I weighed in the political theater. I'm going to go back to the meat and potatoes of what this channel is all about, which is energy, peak oil, the fake fire economy, and the imminent collapse of civilization, which I think is probably just around the corner. Okay, so for the people I blocked, if you want to be unblocked, send me a friend invite, provided you're not a complete and total lunatic. I'll unblock you. Okay, everything's copacetic again. Alright, on to consequentialism. I'm sorry, my last mic broke. I've got a very old cheap mic here, which I don't know how it's going to sound until I'm done. Alright, consequentialism is a subset of utilitarianism, and don't worry, this isn't going to be some pedantic academic lecture. I'm just going to do it like a 20,000 foot high gloss overview of it. I may go to the wiki page, we may touch upon a couple topics, but what I'm going to say first is that despite what you might think, you're well versed in the arguments of consequentialism. If you've ever seen more than a couple of dozen Hollywood movies, you've come across this, believe me. If you're more than 20 years old, you've encountered this argument many, many times, whether you realize it or not. Okay, so the movie metaphor that I'm going to use for this is a 2010 movie called Unthinkable, starring Samuel Jackson, and who was the other guy who was in this? Michael Sheen. Samuel Jackson is this interrogator, a rather vicious, ruthless interrogator in the movie. And the person that he's interrogating has planted several nuclear bombs throughout the country, has left a videotape record of that fact, and now Samuel Jackson is trying to extract the information from him as to where the bombs are located and how to disarm them. And he's using, we'll get into that. We'll get into his tactics. Now, back to consequentialism. Consequentialism works to the degree that it does work. It works best when there's an extreme disparity between the good and the bad, the pros and the cons. In fact, consequentialists, the common term for that they use for justifying consequentialism, moral good or the moral goods. And some philosophers just abbreviate it. They call it the good or the goods. But anyway, that's what it's about. Whereas utilitarianism is basically defined by producing individual happiness. Individual happiness is good, right, in utilitarianism, and the greatest good is the greatest aggregate of individual happiness. That's it in a nutshell. So consequentialism is a subset of that just focuses on the goods. All right, back to the Hollywood movie metaphors. Back to Unthinkable. So in this case, you have the imminent destruction of millions of people all around the country by these 3 nuclear weapons versus the torture of this one man in this dungeon chamber that Jackson has prepared for him. And so most of us look at that and we say, well, I don't like torture. No, that's bad. But on the other hand, let's talk, the greatest good is millions of people not being incinerated by nuclear weapons, you know, with the power of 1,000 suns, having their eyeballs burned out. That takes precedence. That is the greater good over one guy being tortured, right? Okay, so we're willing to allow, you know, Jackson going to work on this guy with the pliers and a blowtorch, a few fingernails being pulled out, a few missing teeth, for the sake of saving millions of people. Now that's the kind of scenario where consequentialism works rather easily, except for extremists like Immanuel Kant. Maybe I'll save that for another video, but Immanuel Kant would say no, that violates, you know, the principles of individual liberty and human rights, and it's never right, even to save a million people. Which I think, and I think most people would agree, is just perfectly crazy. Okay, that's why Kant, as a philosopher, fails on so many levels. We all know that to save millions of people, if one guy, especially, see, here's the deal. If it was just, let's say it was just one guy chosen at random, of course that wouldn't work, right? So Hollywood has to sweeten the pot. They have to up the ante by giving us probable cause, like this is the guy, or you know, absolute incontrovertible evidence. This is the guy who planted the bombs. So now we're sure. Now we can feel good about this guy being tortured, so that millions of people don't have to die, right? And this is the standard. This is the standard foil in a lot of these Hollywood movies. I know you guys you must have seen at least half a dozen, or if not dozens of movies where this is played out, right? I mean, some of the, you know, if you like Turner Classic movies, how many of us have never seen a lifeboat movie, right? Ship goes down, 20 people in a lifeboat, and there's one son of a bitch with a flare gun commanding the boat, you know, tyrannizing the entire boat, maybe keeping all the food and water for himself, and he can do that because he has a flare gun, right? It's his boat. So everybody else has to suffer while this one guy just runs riot over the whole affair. And we say, well, what's better? That, you know, 19 people go without food and water so this one guy can have everything, or do we break his skull open with a boat oar? Yeah. You bring a boat oar down between his ears, toss him overboard, and now everybody gets their fair share of food and water. Pretty simple. Another consequentialist argument. And it works in that situation. It works because of the extreme disparity. You know, 20 people on a boat, 19 going hungry without water, one guy having it all. Fuck that one guy. Okay? Who's an asshole to begin with, and the world's not going to miss it, right? Fuck that guy. So it works in situations like that. Consequentialism works really well when there's extreme disparity between the good or the goods and the bad. Okay. Now let's talk about some situations where maybe it doesn't work so well. Let's go back to that lifeboat scenario. What if, you know, what if it was 12 against 8? What if there were 8 guys, say they're, I don't know, soccer hooligans, and they've taken over the boat, so now 12 people are without food, and the 8 guys have it all. What's the best choice in this? King the boat or down between the ears of all these soccer hooligans, chuck them out in the water? Now it's 12 to 8, you know, odds are a little different. It's still the greatest good. We still got that going for us, so the consequentialist argument still holds, but not as much, right? Not as much. So that's where the consequentialist argument gets tougher, when in these gray areas, when, well, I guess here's the rub, right? Who's there? Do you have an absolute observer to define the greatest good? And I guess I'll go to the Wikipedia page on this, and don't worry, this isn't going to get too pedantic or academic. Agent neutral, they call it issues in consequentialism. You need an agent neutral observer, or you need an ideal observer on that boat to determine what is the greatest aggregate of common good, right? And it gets very tricky, you know, as, like I said, consequentialism works great when you're talking about million horrible deaths versus one guy getting his fingernails pulled out easily. Works effortlessly and easily in that case. But when you get to these gray areas, it's much, much tougher. Okay, let's bring this home to the United States. Let's talk about something like the Patriot Act. Okay, now the Patriot Act was sold to us, sold to Congress and the American people on the basis it was post 9/11, and we said, well, we've got to do something to secure the country. We're in danger from these Al-Qaedas and, you know, these fanatical Islamists and so on. So we've got to do something, and not just exclusive to them, but any terrorist, right? So we've got to do something about this. And even though prior to this, we've defined freedom as one of the eternal verities, as one of the inviolable and goods, you know, one of the cherished goods of our society was freedom and liberty, right? So, well, times have changed. Times have changed. Now we've got these terrorist, lunatic motherfuckers running around, and we got to do something about it. So you're going to have to give up just a little bit of your liberty so that we can protect you, you know. And the consequentialist argument was made that it was in the interest of the greater good of society, right? If good is based on human happiness, which can also be defined as the absence of pain, then the greatest good is the greatest aggregate happiness of the greatest number in society, right? Which is the, you know, your cities don't get nuked, right? And to do that, we got to take away a little of your liberty and pass this Patriot Act. And there was a fair amount, actually there was almost no debate in this in our legislature, but there was a fair amount of debate in the blogosphere, in news groups, in the media, some media, and it passed, as we all know. And so we lost a little bit of our liberty. It got a little bit eroded, and this was based on the consequentialist argument. Well, now you're safer. And, point of fact, there hasn't been another terrorist attack in the United States in the last 10 years. So thank you for that. But see, now, we're talking about the weaknesses of consequentialism. Here's one of the major weaknesses. And I'm going to go slow here, because it's very important to, even though I'm doing this in a high level, it's very important to get this right. We're talking about the greater good, right? The problem with consequentialism is that you become hostage to circumstances. You go in hock to circumstances over what may be the longer term greater good. Again, going back to the ideal observer. Who would be the ideal observer? The ideal, let's combine a couple terms. We'll call him the ideal, human-centered, agent-neutral observer. Okay, you with me so far? What that observer might construct as the greater goods, the greater moral good for society, might be based not on a short-term view, or even a medium-term view, but might be based on a long-term view. Right? And I would argue that the founding fathers of the United States were just such people. Now, I'm not saying they were perfect, but they were probably as close to ideal, agent-neutral, human-centered observers as you're likely to get in historical memory. And they realized, which is, you know, why they drafted the Constitution the way that it was drafted, and the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence. The reason it was written the way that it was written is because they realized the dangers of state tyranny in the medium and long term, and that being a slave to circumstance might produce some short-term good, even short-term greater good for the society, but in the long term, it was destructive. It was destructive to the human spirit, to overall human rights, etc. So you see here This is the real danger of consequentialism, is that it gives you, very often it can give you these short-term gains. It could give you the greater good, even for the greater number, in the short term. But in the longer term, it can be harmful. Okay, so that's one of its biggest drawbacks. Okay, so that's basically it in a nutshell. I've gone through the major portions of it. You know, at a high level. I mean, I can do maybe a part 2 of this video where we get into the nitty-gritty and you know, go through all the various issues: action guidance, ideal observer, real observer, consequences for whom, agent-focused or agent-neutral, human-centered, kinds of consequences, virtue ethics, ultimate end. We can make some differentiations, you know, going into the philosophy of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, make some distinctions between consequentialism and utilitarianism, but I didn't really want to do that in this video. I just wanted to give you, you know, the high-level view of things. So that's it. Yeah, maybe I'll just keep this short sub 20-minute video, and just, yeah, give it some thought, just food for thought, because I know many of you've probably seen your fair share of Hollywood movies. Hollywood loves this concept. They're absolutely in love with it. And like I said, to set up a consequentialist argument, basically you have oops, microphone fell off, sorry about that. You have good guys versus bad guys, but that's usually not enough. They usually have to make it really extreme, where there can be no doubt in the moviegoer's mind as to the terrible moral character and ethical character of the bad guy. Oh, that actually might be a good distinction to make, subtle distinction to make. Consequentialism does not rely upon motive or the morality of the actor. It's not based on that. Okay, it's based on the goods, the ultimate moral good. So somebody may have bad motives, but if in the end, I mean, let's use an extreme example, and you'll hear there are consequentialists who make this argument. Use the extreme example of a murderer who comes to your door and asks you for the name and address of a certain person, and you know, talking to this person, that they're going to go murder this man, you know, if you give them this information. But suppose in the long term it would be beneficial for society to be rid of this person, right? So that's an example of where motive and ethics and the morality of the person carrying out the act doesn't come into play. I guess that's another issue in consequential. You might say it's a major issue, but you know, what if the ultimate outcome is actually for the better of society? And where have we seen movies like this? Oh, I guess God, there's been so many. The Professional. There's been almost too many to go through here. You know, movies where James Bond, perfect example. The anti-hero, right? The anti-hero character does things which most people would consider morally abhorrent, repulsive, right? He can be like fucking his secretary, then the next second he's like looking over his shoulder, shooting some guy in the head with his Walter PPK, but it's for the greater good of you know, the Queen Zone or King Zone and the world as a whole. So he's what's called an anti-heroic character. And all Bond movies, you know, follow that same theme, use that same motif, and they're wildly popular. So people, you know, there's been so many of these movies made. People get the idea, they get the concept. But I guess what I'm going to end with here is that, yes, while consequentialism does, in many cases, produce short-term good, even good for the greatest numbers, it's very unclear, unless you have this perfect neutral human-centered observer, it's nebulous, it's vague. What is actually the greatest good for either any one person or the greatest number? What is that? Who's going to determine that greatest good? All right. Hope that wasn't too awfully boring. Thanks for listening. We'll pick this up in future discussions.